They don't send troops, they don't build bases, but they do control governments. While the world watches tanks roll across borders, currencies break down, and alliances shift, one institution has quietly expanded its influence behind the scenes: the International Monetary Fund. It doesn't govern by force, it governs by debt. In this episode of the Watchtower Report, we expose how the IMF has used financial crisis after financial crisis to consolidate its power, override national sovereignty, and reshape the world economy to serve a single purpose: control. Who really holds the reins of global finance? And why are more and more countries now trying to escape? This is the Watchtower Report, where strategy meets reality. The IMF's origin story, a tool of stability or control. The International Monetary Fund was created in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference. Its original mission was simple: stabilize currencies, support struggling economies, and promote global financial cooperation. But from the beginning, it was anchored in U.S. power. The United States supplied most of the capital, hosted the headquarters in Washington, and retained veto power over major decisions. On paper, the IMF was meant to be a lifeline for countries in crisis. In reality, it became the gatekeeper of access to the global financial system, and its loans came with strings attached. The Playbook: how the IMF gains control. Here's how it works. A country hits a financial wall. It can't pay its debts, its currency crashes, and investors flee. The IMF steps in with an emergency loan. But the money comes with conditions: privatize public assets, slash government spending, open markets to foreign corporations, and peg the currency. They call it structural adjustment. In reality, it's austerity. Hospitals close. Food and fuel subsidies vanish. Unemployment spikes. And as foreign investors take control of national industries, the government's sovereignty slowly dissolves. It happened in Argentina. It happened in Greece. It happened in dozens of African and Asian countries throughout the 1980s and 90s. Each time the IMF promised recovery. Each time the people paid the price. The debt trap strategy. The real power of the IMF isn't the money it gives, it's the debt it creates. Once a country takes an IMF loan, its creditworthiness is tied to IMF approval. Other lenders, the World Bank, private banks, even other countries, wait to see what the IMF says. If the IMF cuts off support, a country is essentially blacklisted. This gives the IMF extraordinary leverage. It doesn't need to invade, it just needs to pause funding. And politicians fall in line. But the trap doesn't end there. Many IMF programs are designed not to end the crisis, but to extend the loan cycle. Each new crisis leads to more conditional loans. The country becomes dependent, its future is mortgaged, and the terms of repayment are almost always dictated by Washington. SDRs, digital control, and the coming reset. The IMF doesn't just issue loans, it also controls a synthetic global currency, special drawing rights, or SDRs. These SDRs act like reserve assets used by central banks to stabilize their currencies. The IMF can allocate SDRs during a crisis and decide who gets how much. But what if those SDRs go digital? There are growing calls inside the IMF and affiliated institutions to digitize SDRs into programmable currency. These wouldn't just act as stabilizers. They could be tracked, time-limited, and conditioned. Combined with central bank digital currencies, this system could allow the IMF to monitor and influence how nations use their reserves in real time. In a post-crisis world, the SDR could become the foundation of a new global digital currency system, one controlled not by elected governments, but by unelected technocrats. BRICS and the revolt against IMF hegemony. Not everyone is playing along. The rise of BRICS and BRICS Plus represents a growing backlash against IMF dominance. Countries like China, Russia, Brazil, and now Saudi Arabia and Iran are building alternatives. Development banks, currency swap networks, and possibly their own commodity-backed currency. These countries don't want conditional loans. They want independence. We're watching a split in the global financial order. On one side, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and Western central banks. On the other, the emerging multipolar bloc, creating new pathways around dollar dependence and IMF oversight. This is more than economics. It's a geopolitical rebellion, and the IMF knows it. That's why it's racing to integrate SDRs, digital frameworks, and debt-linked climate funding into a tighter, more centralized system. They say the IMF brings stability, but stability for whom? For local communities forced into austerity? Or for global capital markets that demand obedience? The real story of the IMF isn't about financial rescue. It's about soft control, using numbers instead of soldiers, contracts instead of coups, compliance instead of chaos. But the tide is shifting. Countries are pushing back, new alliances are forming, and in the power vacuum that emerges after each crisis, a new architecture is being built. One thing is clear: whoever controls the money controls the rules. This has been the Watchtower Report, where strategy meets reality. Subscribe for more. Share this if you believe the game is bigger than politics. And as always, we'll be watching.